Call this order to meeting, the meeting to order for the Tuesday, November 19th, 2024 Finance and Budget Committee meeting. I do want to announce first that we did have an executive session at 5:30 this evening discussing safety projects. 1.02, pledge to the flag.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
1.03, roll call, please.
Elizabeth Dolberman. Here. Mary Lee Hall.
Here.
Samantha Hall.
Here.
William Hall.
Here.
Jennifer Henkel.
Here.
Nathan Henkel.
Here.
James Holly.
Here.
Jeremy Hash. And Joseph Wilson.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving on, 2.01. Do we have any public comment this evening? I do not believe so. All right. Moving along to 2.02. No public comment, no discussion. 3.01. Here. So this meeting tonight is to discuss basic guidelines for budget development for the 2024-2025 school year. No, 2025-2026 school year. Sue, do we have anything we want to add to the purpose of this?
Nope.
Okay.
Good.
All right. So 3.02, reviewing budget information. I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Green. And Mr. Sanders. Yep.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. So this is the time of year when we start taking a look at the 25-26 budget already. So purpose of the meeting. So our purpose this evening is to give a presentation to show the board that we're able to stay within the PDE index of 5%. This year's a little different in that it is required if we take the adequacy funding, which we did accept the adequacy funding for 24-25 of about $500 and some thousand, that the board would stay within the index. So in this case, there's a little bit less to decide than normal, but we are going to show you that we believe it is possible to stay within the 5% PDE index. Also for the board to provide basic guidelines for the administration in budget development. So if there's anything in particular that you'd like to see in the budget, let us know that either now or at a subsequent meeting. We'll also talk about the capital projects funding and transfers. So we looked at those at the October Buildings and Grounds Committee meeting. And then I also want to stress that it is very early in the year. So I use the word conservative a lot in budgeting because that's kind of an accounting thing, but sometimes people say that, Sue, we don't really know what that means, so I'm going to explain that a little bit. So that's really that we look at it cautiously. So it's not what I would consider overinflated as much as it is we have assumptions built in to make sure that we wouldn't go over budget. So it's not gloom and doom, worst case scenario, but it is a cautious or conservative budget at this point because there are a lot of things that we're just learning or we haven't learned yet because we're just a couple months into the school year for 24-25. So we kind of do this every year when we look at budgeting. So I think a lot of times when people look at budgeting, they say, okay, what do we want to do for 25-26? But it's really important to take a look at what happened in the past. So what happened in 23-24? What happened in 24-25? So what's going on right now? And then where do we want to go in the future? So you got to look at where you've been, where you are now, and then where you want to go in the future in order to really make it make sense. And what has changed between 1, 2, and 3? So we're looking at the numbers. We're also analyzing what has changed as we walk through things. We'll look at special ed a little bit this evening and what has changed in that area in the 3 years that we're looking at.
All right, so I'll take us through the 23-24 results and just kind of briefly summarize where we've been. I know Mrs. Green gave a presentation, I believe, last month or the month before. Just some preliminary results, but a little bit more detail now. So prior year, our revenues were over budget, so that's a good thing when the revenues are over budget. So we were over budget by about 1.68 million, which is about 4% of budget. So some of the big highlights that we were over were earned income tax. That's a really fun one to see that keeps growing year over year. We've talked a lot about it at previous meetings, and it's been very public in the news. Interest earnings for a lot of people, that really went up. So we too had about $890,000 more interest earnings than was budgeted. And a lot of that has to do with, at that time, we had no idea that rates would stay so high for so long. Basic ed funding, so another highlight, that went up about $568,000 over budget. So when we continue to get money from the state, that's a very good thing. And again, those are just three highlights with our revenues, how we got to the 1.68 million. And then our expenditures were under budget by about 2.96 million. So again, right around that 4.5%. So a lot of this we've talked about in previous budget meetings, but one of the bigger areas were salary and benefits. So salaries were about $955,000 under budget. A lot of that might have to do with unfilled positions, vacancies throughout the year, and then the change of the demographic of the person that we budgeted at that time, and then the employee that ultimately filled that position. So benefits go with that. If salaries are down, benefits typically are down. That's either because of the pension system, so we're not paying pension benefits for an employee that's not here. They may not have had their health insurance, things like that. So then the other ones are purchase services. I combined them and just said all. That was about $800,000 over budget. Purchase services would be something along the lines of student placements or IU costs, substitute teachers, charter schools, tech ed, so those going to York County School of Technology, those would all fall in that purchase service category. And in total, that was about $800,000 under budget. And then one big thing to note is that we have other revenues this year. We normally don't have other revenues. That was $6.4 million. And again, we don't really budget in that category, so I'll talk about that on the next slide.
So can we just hold here a second? So the one thing we wanted to point out here also is, so we're about 4% over budget in revenues, so that's positive, and we're about 4%, 4.5% under budget on expenditures. That is not what I say quote unquote normal. Usually we like to stay within about 2%. So things are on the revenue side very positive, and on the expenditure side very positive. You're going to hear and see a turn on that this evening, where some of the areas are not quite as positive going forward. So this is a good thing. It does look like, okay, we're driving a surplus, but that's because things were very positive in both directions in revenue and expenditures. This doesn't happen often. We celebrate when it does. So just wanted to kind of point that out, that like Mr. Carrington said, purchase services, a lot of our placements, charter schools, things like that were lower than what we predicted. That was a good thing. It doesn't happen a lot, but as we look into this year's budget and next year's budget, we're not seeing quite the same story unfolding.
So this is just some accounting knowledge, because again, this is going to look different when we do get our financials. And then if you do look to understand. So this year is a little bit different. We had other revenues of 6.4 million. Normally we'll have other revenues, and it might be something like an accounting gross up entry. So that's the gross up of leases and subscription-based IT. That is truly accounting mumbo jumbo in a way, because it's reflected with another expense equaling the exact same amount. So no actual up or down, it was a net zero. We also had proceeds from insurance of about $100,000 related to insurance claims. That's not medical, that's more building damage, things like that. We had that bad storm last August.
So we would also have had expenses relative to that $112,000.
So again, those two are kind of net. The big one is other revenues, which is a transfer from the debt service fund, and I'll round and say it's about $6.3 million. All that really represents is it moving from one bucket in the debt service fund to the general fund, but for accounting purposes, it's presented as a revenue. It's just taking it from bucket A and putting it in bucket B. But again, it makes it look a little bit messy when you kind of see it in the accounting income statement type deal, because it does report as an other revenue. So overall, revenues exceeded expenditures by about $3.3 million. And then you would add in that $6.2 million transfer from debt service to the general fund. But again, we like explaining it that way because it's really moving it from one bucket to another.
Is that because we paid off some bonds early and didn't have to service them any longer, or?
No, so if you remember in the spring, we talked about that, when our plan was to continue through with the building projects and continue to issue bonds and continue with the buildings. We had it over in the debt service fund to help pay for bonds as we issued bonds. Well, because we were kind of slowing things down with the feasibility study and the projects, we moved it back over to general fund because there was no anticipation of issuing bonds in the near future.
Okay.
So we wanted to just sit over there because unless we were issuing bonds, we would not have a purpose for it.
So
So I think that was, I'm sorry, I think that was at the March or April meeting, there was a board vote to move that back over to general fund. But I know it kind of all just rolls together. But that's why we want to point it out as we're going through things, so I'm sure folks remember that.
So that's where we were with the 23-24 fiscal year. Now we're going to talk through where we are, or where we think we are. It is pretty early in the year, even though it's November. A lot of numbers, they come in, but most of our year happens at the June, July, even August, when we get a lot of our revenue numbers. So this is just where we think we are for the 24-25 year. So revenues at this point, they're exceeding budget by about $892,000. So again, anytime revenues are over budget, that's a good thing. Some really contrasting things now. Local revenue is about $211,000 over budget. Primarily, that's earned income taxes. We're not seeing the same amount of real estate assessment that we've been seeing. We'll talk about that later when we talk about the revenue budget. A highlight, though, is our state revenue. So this year, we received a couple new revenue streams from the state. So one of them was adequacy funding. Sue mentioned that. This year, that was about $519,000 for us. So that was a really well-received revenue source that we didn't have budgeted anywhere. And then we also received charter school funding. We have, again, not received any of that in many, many years. At least since I've been here, we haven't had charter school funding. And that was about $135,000. The other item to note for our projections, we are up about $41,000 in federal revenue. Really, all that is just the final use of our ESSER funding. Something came in July. So at that point, we thought it was going to come in June. It was a little late, so that's why it's showing the $41,000 this year. So our expenditure projections, we'll be spending a little bit more time on them. At this point in the year, with our conservative budget methodology, we're about $269,000 under budget. So again, being under budget is a good thing. That's about 0.4% of the budget. So a lot of the past several years, we've been saying we have many unfilled positions or many positions that we are trying to fill, but they are vacant. We're not really in that same spot. We do have some unfilled positions. But again, it's nowhere like we've seen in the past 4 years. Something we will focus on a little bit more during this presentation. We have seen a pretty sharp rise in our special education and placement expenditures. And then we do have an increase in utility costs. A couple items to note for the utility costs. It's more of a utilization increase and less of a cost increase in the utility. So we do hedge, we do a lot of forward looking on that. We've been using more utilities. So that balanced with the increase in cost is something just to note for our projections.
Is that across all buildings, or does it seem like it's?
We, at least at this point, we just look at it from what we used last year.
Got it.
So it was a lot more electricity. It could be related to our building project, which we think, and I know moving forward into projections at the end of the year and then budget, we do have just some cost increases that aren't even something you can hedge. It's just an increase in some adder fees that all companies and individuals would be paying.
So at the high school last year, if you think about, we didn't demo until June, so we had more square footage overall. So that's one area where we think we may have had an increase that might go back down again as we get into the building and close up the building and those kinds of things.
So kind of tricky to see, but just a summary of the big budget areas where we have ups and downs. Salaries, they're down about $345,000. And again, that's just our expectation. All of these are expectations and they can and will change. So one of the big reasons for salaries and benefits being lower, we do have a change in our methodology that we put into place, I think 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, where if a position is vacant, we're going to replace, for a teaching position, we would replace it with an instructional step 1 before we were doing somewhere in the master's column. But we had been seeing a lot of budget to projection surpluses in that area. So that's something we implemented a few years ago to kind of tighten up from budget to budget. As Sue mentioned, we'll be seeing a big increase in our IU and other placement costs, so that's up about $260,000. That being said, charters in York County School of Technology, budget to projections, were down a little bit. And really what that is just kind of stabilizing with our enrollment and our attendance at those charters and YCST. Utility costs, that is up about $102,000 over budget. And everything else, really, there's ups and downs in that, but it nets to about $70,000. Then, one item just to note, it doesn't include an $840,000 difference in our budgeted and actual debt service transfer. Sue will cover that later in the presentation. That's the debt service we've left in the budget versus our actual debt payments. So really, just as it boils down.
Before we move forward, if I can.
Yeah.
So, slide before, says we're 269,000 under budget, and then we're projecting to be 269,000 over budget, so is that, do they offset?
It's under,
No,
there's a minus.
It's under. They're both under.
It's, the minus is showing under budget.
Oh, both, okay, so
Yeah,
that's the
both.
sum, that's the breakout of the 269 slide
Yes.
before.
Yes.
Yep.
Gotcha, thank you.
And
Yeah, and we, just so you know, Bill, we do the same thing sometimes, because Trevor will put a plus, and I'll say, no, that's a revenue, so should be negative, so we do the same thing.
No, I got
Sometimes it's hard to see which direction it's supposed to be going.
I mean, it is, it's under budget, but it is, yeah, I got you.
Yeah. We do the same thing.
so, all that said, what it boils down to, our projected revenues are just under $65 million at $64,900. And our projected expenditures at this point are $66,159. So at this point in the year, we are expecting to use some of our fund balance in the amount of about $1.2 million. The 24-25 budget had the use of fund balance at $2.4 million. So we are under our expected use of fund balance at this point.
So let me pause there a second, because I think it's important to kind of pause and talk about this. So we changed our methodology there also in how much we were putting in for use of fund balance to equal 1% of revenue, the revenue budget, and 3% of the expenditure budget. So although it looks like, oh, we're doing well, we're still using fund balance, which means we're not covering operations. So I do want to point that out now. Is this cautious at this point? I don't think it's going to come in exactly like this, but are we going to possibly use fund balance this year? I do think we will probably use some fund balance. So it's important to note that. We have a significant or sufficient amount of fund balance because we put it away for capital projects. But as you use fund balance, you have to make that up each and every year. And that's the piece that is sometimes difficult to wrap your head around. I always equate it to, it's like paying your mortgage. If you get a $10,000 bonus and you expect to pay your mortgage with that each month, if you're only getting it once a year, you can't pay your mortgage each month with it. So this is kind of the same thing. As we walk through it, I think that's important to point out. We're good, but I just also want to point out, as we use fund balance, we've got to make that up at some point.
But hopefully I'm on the same page with you. That same fund balance is the 3.3 million we put in there from last year, that same fund balance.
Right.
So we were 3.3,
We were 3.3 to the good last year. Right now,
Right.
we're estimating we're 1.2 to the negative
right.
at this point in time. Right. And when you have a surplus, so let me talk a little bit about that. When you have a surplus, like the 3.3, you can use that for capital projects. You can use that for one-time things. So a lot of times we don't build one-time things and capital projects into the budget because we know there's a chance we're going to have a surplus, because the opposite is to be, negative. And so, as we balance that, that's the piece to kind of understand. Does that make sense? Okay, so now we're going to look at the 25-26 budget. Thanks. So we're very early on, we can't say that enough. Our goal is to determine whether we can stay within the index. So that's really, as we put this together, that's really what we're looking at. It's reasonable estimates, but they're cautious. So we'll continue to look at them and revise them based upon operations. So as we walk through this, that's important to note. I will say this, though. Big pieces we do know. We do know what the debt service is. We do know, for the most part, salaries and benefits, because, we know the people that are here and how much we're paying them. So a lot of those big pieces we do know. Some of the other things that we don't know quite as much are special needs that might come out throughout the year for children. Do we need another bus? Do we need another placement? Do we have something else happen like that? So those are the things that we're unsure of as we work through things. Are we going to have a big snowstorm? Is the Fed going to cut rates 3 times instead of raise them 3 times? So it's those kinds of things that we're still working through with the 25-26 budget. So salary increases, health insurance, special ed needs, retirement expense, and contingency are our big cost drivers right now. So we'll walk through each of those. So salaries are up about $1.1 million. That's about 4.02%. So that's our negotiated increases, plus we have 2 additional positions in there. So we have our current positions plus 1 enrollment position. We always put that in at this time of the budget, just to make sure in case we have a class size that's large that we can add another teacher. And we have also added the school safety and security director. That position is in the budget, and we're looking right now, working through that. So that one is already in the budget, even though we don't have it at this time. So our salaries went up 1.1 million, benefits went up about $1.6 million. We'll talk a little bit about that. And as I said, salaries and benefits are generally between 67 and 69% of the budget. So it is big bulk of what our costs are. So we'll look at a retirement rate. Right now, the estimates show the retirement rate at 34.72%. Up from 33.9, so almost up a percentage point. That doesn't seem like a lot on the surface, but remember, the way it works is that is the rate applied to every salary dollar. So from every salary dollar from $1, we're going up almost 1%. And any new salary dollars from the slide below, it's almost 35 cents. So that's really where the $588,000 or 6.61% change comes from. Now, that may go up or down with the December certification. We kind of cross our fingers at this point in time. The last 2 years, it has gone down, but before that, probably the last 20 years, it went up. So we'll stay tuned for that. That'll either be good news or bad news at a subsequent meeting as we get through that. I'm hoping it's going to go down again. And then with Peasers in retirement, we get half of that back from the state in revenue. So it's a $588,000 expense hit, but it is a $294,000 revenue hit. Okay, so now we're going to talk about health insurance. So we have the chart here, and we have the total plan costs are your light blue line, and funding is your dark blue line. So as we walk through this, I call it a roller coaster, and it really does look like a roller coaster in the slide. It goes up, down, and all over the place. And so when we're dealing with health insurance, we are self-insured. So we're really dealing with the medical needs of our employees and their dependents, and it is never like a nice, neat thing. Over the last 15 years, we have gone from low to high, back to low, and we're now on an uptick. So as we walk through this, 13-14 through 19-20, funding rates exceeded claims costs. But now we're at the other way where claims costs are exceeding funding rates. So at one point, our reserves, so we have three components here. We have claims, administrative fees, and a reserve for health insurance. And at one point, our reserves were so high, they were at 700% of what we needed. So we did a combination of freezing rates and taking funding holidays. When you take a funding holiday, basically, we don't pay for a month or two, and it stays here in the district, because once it goes to the trust, it artificially lowers our rates. Even though our claims costs are going up, it would artificially lower our rates, which we don't want to do, because we know that insurance rates are generally going up. And so we've taken funding holidays for 2 years, and we took 2 each of the years, and that equated to about $1.3 million that we kept at the district that we did not send to Lincoln Benefit Trust. We're now in the situation where it's kind of flipped the other way. Our reserves are very low because our claims costs are going up more quickly. We are recommending, if you want to go to the next slide. We are recommending for 25-26 that we do a premium increase of 15%, and that we send $490,000 to Lincoln Benefit Trust. So kind of the opposite of a funding holiday, we're actually going to send more money to build up those reserves. Because some of our increase right now is to get the reserve back up to where it needs to be. So what we don't want to do is we want to try not to get in the opposite things where our reserves, we're going up too quickly and our reserves are too high again. So it is a little bit of a roller coaster. I believe that 15% and sending funding is the best way to go. I think we both believe that. One of the reasons is we had, in 23-24, we had a 15% increase. This year we have a 17% increase. If we do a 15% again, we're at 47% over the last 3 years. Now, we had very low rate increases for quite a period of time, but at 47%, it's going to do a couple things. It's going to get us slightly above average at Lincoln Benefit Trust for our costs, and it also, I think it's going to stabilize us. So we want to try to do this slowly and deliberately. And the one thing that's very tricky on the chart, it looks like, oh, well, you can kind of tell what was going to happen, but the problem is you're doing it so far in advance of when you have the information. So for instance, we've just got the information on what happened for the end of 23-24. We're in the middle of 24-25, and we're trying to figure out what's going to happen in 25-26. So it's one of those things where, oh, I wish I had that back then. It would have been a lot easier to make this work. But that's really what it is. It's so far, by the time you realize you're having a bad year, it's like 3/4 or more gone. And really what's happening with us now is we're having a lot of high claimants as we walk through insurance. So the budget impact for this is about $865,000, or about 16%. It's a little bit higher than our premium increase, and some of that has to do with what decisions folks make. Like, so as we hire different people, they may be a family plan versus they were a single plan before. So that makes a difference also. And then, of course, any rate increase that we have is a rate increase passed on to our employees who pay a percentage of premium. So as we smooth things out, that's another consideration we always make is the impact to the staff.
We have reinsurance for any claims that go beyond a certain level. Given that, is there like an upper bound on that light blue line in terms of how high that could go in a single year? So I see you have it trending upwards and you have trending fairly gradually, so I assume it's nowhere near what it could be in the worst case. But what's the worst that it could move in 1 year before reinsurance would kick in?
Well, that's a little tricky to determine, and here's why, because reinsurance is based upon
Individuals.
the claim.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if I'm an insured person, at $100,000, we have reinsurance through Lincoln Benefit Trust mini pool. $300,000, we have reinsurance through PA Trust. But because we cover so many lives, not that it would ever happen, but if every single person that we covered had a $100,000 claim, that would be the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
That would never happen, but it's very difficult to tell for sure what the worst case would be.
Sure, yeah. I guess historically, do we have like a maximum number of claims that hit that ceiling that we can look back on? Does that?
Yes, so
Yeah.
during our good years, we would have 3 or 4. We're hitting about 18 to 20 now.
So is this the worst it's ever been?
No.
No?
So that period, so I always joke with Trevor, when Trevor walked in, things just were like wonderful. Things just turned around and health insurance was like declining and
And ever
you know, all
since he's
these
been
things.
here.
Yes, ever since, this is the
I
first
had a
time.
good 5-year run.
Right, so no, it is very cyclical, and when it happened last time in like 2011, 12, I actually took the whole trust and all of their claims for a 10-year period, and basically what I found was every district went through it. At some point, they went up, and then they went down, and then they went up, so at different times. So interestingly, when we were going through it last time, everyone else was having wonderful years and zeros, and I'm like, what are we doing wrong? But it really is based upon what's going on with your employees. So we have looked at it a lot. We have an actually lower than average staff and people that we cover. Our average age is about 2 years lower than the trust, because we're like, okay, do we have an older population? Do we have, like, what do we have? So there really doesn't seem to be a lot of rhyme or reason to it that we can find. But the one thing we were looking for is, do we believe that a lot of these folks will continue to be on our plan? We do believe that they will be on our plan. And I want to be very careful when I say this. We don't know who the people are. The only thing we know is, like, we could see like the age or a young dependent. We have no identifying information, so I don't know who the people are. It's just we're looking for trends, or if we believe we're going to continue to insure the folks. And we do believe that in this case, a lot of these folks will continue to be on our plan as we go forward. For the board, did put together a 3-4 page document kind of walking through this, so I saw a couple of people taking notes. I will send that out to you tomorrow to kind of be able to walk through the history of what things happen and kind of explaining this a little bit more, because I know it is very complicated and kind of hard to get your head around. The one thing I do want to point out, though, that I always kind of have to take myself back to is we're self-insured, and so over time, we have had very low percentages over a period of time, even though we're looking at now and saying 15, 17. But if you look at it over a period of time, it has been low on average. And like I said, we brought back $1.3 million, so that's a chunk of change, in addition to those years not really having any rate increases. So, overall, these years, but it'll turn, because we're, as we do these increases, I believe we have 1 or 2 more years. The other thing this plan does that I think is important to talk about is by 26 26, 27, I have a typo on that slide, I apologize. By 26, 27, if we put this plan in place, our claims costs will estimate our funding rates, and that's really what you want to get to. You don't want funding to increase reserves or to offset claims costs. You want them to equal. So that's really why we recommended 15%, because based upon the actuarial assumptions, if we do 15% for 25, 26 and 15% for 26, 27, then we will our funding rates will equal our claims costs. And that's really what you're trying to get to. Now, it's going to change between now and next year. I mean, this is just based on assumptions at this point, but that's really the goal. If this plan, it would be 3 more years before we got our funding rates to equal claims costs, we would not be recommending this. We will be recommending higher because we have to get to that point. So really, that's the goal. And as you read through the paper that we put together, hopefully that'll be clear. This will be something we would have on the December board meeting because we wanted to make sure you had plenty of time to ask all your questions before you had to vote on it, but we would need it for December because Lincoln Benefit Trust votes in January, so we have to turn in our rates to them. Okay, so special education costs and programs. These kind of go a little bit hand in hand because as you're dealing with health insurance, you're dealing with human beings and their needs, and special education is going to be the same thing. So as we work through it, it's not always how many students we have, it's more about what the needs of the students are. We've also been talking with you about our options being more limited than they were in the past. So there are classrooms shutting down, there are less places for us to have children be able to be educated. We're bringing more of the programs back here, and we're continuing to look at that. We're also looking at working with other districts where I know sometimes we have some children go to another district or children would come here. So as we're working through that, that's really kind of what we're dealing with. Our costs have been relatively low in this area the last couple of years. I think if I looked at a 5-year, it was like 2%, 2%, 5%, 8%, something along that line. They are going up this year. We have some more severe needs of students. So as we work through that, we are also going to put a detailed paper together on this. We do not have that done yet, but this is an area where as we have made a lot of changes, we want to reflect on what that looks like, because we have brought back a lot of classes, and we have done things differently, and like I said, we'll continue to look at that. But this is something as we go through the budget process that we're going to be looking at very closely. So if you want to go to the next slide. So as you can see, special education, it was pretty level there for a while. We had an uptick in 23, 24, and now we have a pretty decent uptick. Over the years, though, that I've been doing this, it's pretty standard to have between an 8 and 10% increase in special ed. We have not been experiencing that. Like I said, we're continuing to work through, making sure we're doing the best for each of the children and most fiscally responsible. But sometimes it is a matter of that's the needs of the children that we have at the time.
Real quick, this chart is a blend of external versus internal.
This is special education across board.
Okay.
And one of the things, Joe, that we're gonna take a deeper dive at that is a little harder to make charts like this, because if we took like a placement chart, it would be difficult to explain because we didn't have the same placements 10 years ago that we have now. We have less. We've brought back a bunch of classrooms, and so as we looked at it globally, we looked at all of special education. Now, it does not include things like occupational therapy and nursing services because they're categorized differently under special ed. These are what are called our 1200, so they're really the educational piece of special ed.
So some other expenses we have that we always like to highlight when doing the budget. So charter school expenditures. The past several years, this was probably more of a highlight of our presentation. This year, it's not so much. So our charter school expenditures, you can see our actual of last year was about around 1.4 million. We budgeted about 1.5. Projected is a little bit under budget, so that's a good thing. And then our budget for next year is just 1.6. And the reason for that is we have to, so the cost for charter school education goes up every year. Below is shown what our calculated cost is for 24-25. So it's about $15,000 for each regular ed student of ours that goes to a charter school. And then about $31,000 for each special education student of ours that goes to a charter school. And there's an asterisk this year. The state passed a law that kind of redid some of the funding for charter schools. And as a result, we are getting a little bit of a savings for our special education students that attend charters. So from July 1 through December 31st, that cost is actually $33,626. But yay, it goes down about $2,500 starting in January. And again, that is just a form that takes our budgeted expenditures, our ADMs, some math gets involved, but it's really just a kind of a quirky form that the state has for funding.
And as we always point out, and I think it's important to point out for special education, every special education student that goes to a charter school, it's that amount of money regardless of what services they need. So they may need speech 2.5 hours a month, and that's what the charge is. So that's something that I hope they continue to work on, just because obviously there's higher need students and there's lower need students with special education cost-wise.
And then what this chart does, it really shows how we stack up in terms of expenditures per student against a few different groups. So we are that red line at the bottom. And again, it's been increasing since 2020 and all the way back since 2013. The blue line would show the charter school expenses per student for our York County peers, except for York City. We did realize that it was probably easier to compare ourselves to the other districts absent York City because they do just have a higher cost and a higher number of students attending charter schools. Next is the blue line, so that's the IU. Everybody in the IU is included in that. And then that green line is the state. So as a percent of our kind of our students, we are spending less than a lot of the districts in the state, so that's a really great thing. And really, that just means we don't have a lot of students attending charter. So even though every year we look at this and it feels painful because, oh, wow, another 100,000 going somewhere else, we are doing, as in looking at the total budget, it's not as much as others are experiencing. So this is just, again, every year we like to kind of highlight some things. Enrollment is one of those things. So for 23-24, you can see our enrollment was 2,796 students. Comparing that to our October 1st student count, we are down in elementary school, so about 35 students less. Middle school went up a little bit, and then everybody can see the high school went down. So for the past several years, we were saying we're about stable enrollment. Now, again, we're decreased by about 81 students, so it's looking more like a decline. And that's just more of a community shift, so not as many families with a lot of kids moving into the community or in the community. So enrollment is something kind of integral to the budget process because we look at all of those things when kind of coming up with what the budget looks like for next year. So to talk through the next year part, we're going to highlight revenues. So revenues at this point in the budget were increased by about 1.5 million, so 1,484,000. So our local revenues They represent about 67% of all of our revenues, so right around 2/3. We have an increase of $509,000, or about 1.2% in local revenues. Some items there, we have an increase in assessment, so our real estate taxes. That budget to budget growth is about $111,000. And really to slow down and pause, we're not seeing the same assessment growth that we've been seeing. Couple years ago, it was over 1% a year. Last year, we were 0.52. So definitely a decline. And at this point, we're budgeting 0.788%, which is just a weighted 3-year average. So hopefully we do hit that. We did not hit our budgeted assessment last year. So hopefully we continue to see growth and more properties coming on the rolls. But again, just not something we've been seeing. One highlight is our earned income tax. So that's budgeted at 3% over current year projections. So right around almost $400,000. So we are seeing wage growth in our community. So real estate transfer tax, no change there. It's something we're watching closely. Interest earnings is really a big question mark because we saw some really high peaks last year. We had about $1.6 million of interest earnings. Right now, we're sticking with what we have in the budget of about 1.1 million because we really can't read the Fed's mind, and I don't know if anybody can, even maybe the Fed. So we're unsure, are rates going to stay around 4.5? Are they going to go to 3.5? We really don't know, and it's not something we're going to, at this point in time, play around with.
So couple points here. One is on assessment. So we have 0.788 budgeted for 25, 26, because as Trevor said, it's a 3-year weighted average. We are at 0.09% year-to-date so far. So 0.09. So we really have not seen any growth so far this year. We just got $1 million in, but it's not going to move the needle very much. So that's probably a little high. The other piece is interest earnings. That's our next
Yep.
slide. So I'm gonna let Trevor go through that and then we have some points on that.
So again, at this point, we are budgeting and projecting that interest earnings will stay at 1.1 million. Last year, we finished with 1.6 million. But to highlight, in 21-22, we had $53,000 of interest earnings. So as quickly as it can go up, it can come down and come down rapidly.
So just wondering, so you would think the opposite side of that interest equation is probably the real estate. You know, our interest earnings are way up because interest is way up, but interest being way up also drives down real estate. So when we had that really low peak, it would be interesting to know where were we on the real estate side? Are they moving juxtaposed to one another?
Not entirely. So just knowing 3 of the last 4 years we had over 1% assessment growth, 3 of the last 4 years we had really high interest earnings. I agree, and economically it would make sense. The lower the mortgage rates, the higher transactions would occur. It just hasn't been that way, but it's also been a really kind of crazy 5 years with a pandemic and people moving and everything along those lines, and some kind of over control from the Fed or just governments kind of playing with interest rates. So we were way too low at 2021 and we're really high now. So we'll see.
So a couple budget pieces here. One is the rate. Obviously, the rate, we've seen extremely low rates to the point of we were paying the bank a little bit more in fees than we were getting in interest. So I'll just caution everyone that can turn around very, very quickly, as we see in this picture, and that will leave a hole, a big hole in our budget. The other piece here is we do have a significant assigned fund balance for building projects. As that goes down, even if the rate would stay the same, our interest earnings are obviously going to decline. So this is coming down.
as we use down our fund balance that's assigned. So just want to caution everyone, again, as we look at things, this will create a place where we're going to have to make up revenue. So as we work through that, I think that's important to note. We are being cautious on this because of the rates changing, but also because as we spend down money, it's going to come down organically just from the money going down. Does that make sense? So this one makes me a little nervous. So sometimes you say, what makes you nervous, Sue? This one makes you a little nervous just because I've lived through $20,000, $30,000 in interest earnings, and that's it. And years where it went from 450,000, not this dramatic, but 450,000 down to like basically nothing. And that's a big hole to fill. So as we're working through, I just wanted to caution everyone on this one too.
So to talk about the other third of our revenues, we have our state funding. That increased by around number 1.1 million. PSERS and FICA subsidy, that went up by 353,000, but that only went up because we were paying more in expense. So it's a good thing, but it's really because more is going out the door. Basic ed and special ed subsidy, the budget includes about a $92,000 increase. And that's really just to match what we're getting now. We did not increase that for budget purposes. There's no real guidance out there on what the increase could be at this time. Some highlights that we touched on earlier in this budget year, but are reflected in next budget year as well, would be a charter school subsidy of $136,000 in the adequacy supplement, which was added to the Ready to Learn block grant. So fingers crossed that the state continues to include these in their future budgets. Again, we're expecting that to be true, but that is another kind of big question mark. Have a really tiny decrease in subsidies and other grants from the state of about $12,000 decrease. And then we are now heading back to normal for federal funding. That decreased by $114,000. All that was expected. That's the decrease in ESSER funding. Now we're just kind of set with our Title 1, 2, and 4 programs, and the funding on that doesn't vary too much year over year. And again, it's met with some ups or downs in expenses. So federal funding is kind of back to where we thought it would be. Then just to kind of go through some grants, these may or may not relate to the 24 year or the 25 year or next budget year. And then in a way, it's just an opportunity for us to kind of pat ourselves on the back. So PCCD, we do have safety grants. This was received in 24-25, so the year we're in, and we will be receiving it in 25-26. So that's about $155,000. And we're just continuing what we were doing for the 24-25 year with that for the budget. The adequacy supplement, it's about $520,000. That was added to the Ready to Learn block grant, which was already about $386,000, so somewhere in the $900,000 total range. And the one we're excited about, the Public Facility Improvement Grant, that's about $909,000. We recently received information that we were going to be awarded that. It is to replace a portion of the roof at the middle school. So that is a matching grant. We have to chip in 25%. So the 909 is the amount we're getting. It's about $1.25 million. And then the other one is the Public School Environmental Repairs Program grant, which is about $190,000, and that relates to our expenses from the asbestos remediation at the high school during our project there.
Okay, so each year we reach out to our administrative team and meet with them about the budget starting in October to talk about what happened last year, what's going on this year, and needs for next year. By November 1st each year, they must submit requests to us on additional items that they're recommending, whether they be staff or other things. This year, we've received
as shown on the screen, new or reinstated staff of about 117,000, allocation requests of about 120,000, one-time items of $107,000. So not a whole lot of requests from our administrative team. So this is a time where we like to give a shout out. They do a great job of being fiscally responsible. We will evaluate these and then bring our recommendations back as we move through the budget process. I'll draw your attention to one-time items. We started this during the recession where if it's a one-time item, we would come to the board usually in January and ask to have it approved. It makes more fiscal sense to approve it out of the current year because we know we're not going to get within $107,000 of a budget. That's a little tight. So it does make more sense than escalating the next year's budget. So especially if it's only going to happen one time and not be reoccurring. So we'll work through that process and we will bring those back. These are not included at this time. The only thing we've included is we did include the safety and security director position. So go through the budget summary. This is for illustrative purposes, just to show that we can stay within the 5% index. So revenues, we have revenues about $65.5 million, expenditures of about $70.2 million, which shows a deficit of $4.7 million. Use of fund balance, we talked about the formula that we started using this year earlier. That would be fund balance use of about $2.8 million, leaving us a deficit of $1,980,000, which is just slightly higher than what we can go as a max of 4.97%, $34,000. Again, it's early on. Right now we have $400,000 in contingency. We usually finish the budget with $300,000 in contingency, so we feel comfortable at this point that we could balance. Okay, so then we'll talk about a little bit about fund balance. The one piece first here is the transfer for the capital reserve for the projects from buildings and grounds. So we have those listed there, those same projects we've been talking about. They total almost $2.8 million. If we subtract out the grant and the undesignated funds that are in the capital reserve fund at this time, the recommended transfer will be about $1.7 million to complete these projects, with the largest being the roof project. So use of fund balance for 24-25. So it was important to kind of walk down through what we have for fund balance at this time. We have the transfer to capital reserve, the $1.7 million that was on the prior screen. We have money assigned for the sewer project of about $1.2 million. The remainder for the high school project of about $3.7 million at this point in time. And then the transfer to Lincoln Benefit Trust that we talked about earlier, the $490,000 for this year, and then recommend $350,000, which we would not approve at this time. That will be for next year, but we do recommend reserving that. So that leaves us use of fund balance of about $7.5 million. So projected fund balance, we started this fiscal year at about $30 million. If you subtract what we think we're going to use for this 24-25 year that Trevor talked about earlier, about $1.6 million, the $7.5 million from the previous screen leaves us with $20.9 million as of the end of this fiscal year. So if we roll it forward to the next fiscal year, we're per board policy, we keep unassigned fund balance of 5%. That's $3.5 million. Our budget deficit that we saw on a previous screen is about $2.8 million. And then that would leave about $14.6 million for future capital projects. So on this screen is just the tax rate comparison. You see Southern in yellow at the bottom. We're at 19.91 mils. If we would go to the max, we would be at 21.24 mils, which without a tax increase, that would have Southeastern be a little over 1 mil above us. So at this point, we are significantly lower than the other local districts in York County. So the other thing we always want to talk about is long-term planning for our building maintenance or our building projects. So we put, as you know, we put a plan in place to reduce the impact to taxpayers. So we do have millage built into the budget at this point. So currently, our debt is about $4.8 million each year, and we have $5.6 million built into the budget. So that does include about $840,000 of extra budgeted debt each year. The plan there was to phase in any additional bonds. As we're not moving in that direction at this point in time, my recommendation would be to keep it in there, because any money we can put back from that 840 means bonds we don't have to issue, especially with interest rates what they are. But anytime, even if interest rates are low, it's just like a mortgage. If you borrow for an extended period of time, 20, 30 years, there is a lot of interest related to that. We are also earning significant interest, as we talked about, on the money right now. So in my recommendation, it is a win-win. The other thing that is very difficult as you're working through it is if we were to need money for a building project, as we work through the last three buildings, it is difficult to phase in all of the millage at one time. This does have part of that millage phased in at this point. So my recommendation is it's a win-win to keep it there. That puts it back that we wouldn't have to issue bonds. Plus, if we were to go to bonds, we'd have some already built in. But I want to make sure everybody understood that as we're moving forward, that there is money there for that, and to reduce debt as we go forward with any feasibility study or projects. And then we also always, when we do a budget presentation, we make sure that the board understands there are different funds in the district besides the general fund. So we have debt service fund of about $358,000, capital reserve about $1.3 million for budgeted projects. So that is sitting out there with specific projects. Retirement fund about $357,000. And then our food service fund with a healthy fund balance of $686,000. And just so everyone knows, that we had never had a fund balance in food service before. It was always negative. So that is positive, and that is due to more additional federal funding that we've been receiving and state funding for the food service program. Also want to point out, we have two rebate programs in our district. One is the property tax rebate program. We made large changes to this in June 2018 to mirror the state program. We budgeted about $105,000, and you can see on the screen what we've rebated in the last several years. It is going down slightly. That's just, some of that I believe is because with the interest earnings, when they fill out their form, folks are getting more interest earnings, so they may not qualify for the program at this point in time. So that, I believe that's some of the reason. The state did make changes to the program in January of 2024. We do not recommend changes at this time, but if the board would desire to make any changes to the program, we would need to do that as part of the budget process. And any changes we would make would be for the 25-26 rebate program, not for the one coming up, because that's part of this year's budget. And then our second rebate program is the Volunteer Firefighter Emergency Services Tax Credit Program. 2022-23 was the first year of the program, where we gave out about $27,500. Last year we gave out about $35,000. We have budgeted $50,000 for this program. We do recommend no change. It's a very new program. We think as it moves forward, we want to give it a couple years to make sure we understand what the impact is. And then Food Service Management Company, 2024-25 is year one for Chartwells. We will be asking for meal prices in January, to take a look at those, whether or not we want to make an increase. It's important for us to have that in January so that we can work through the renewal with Chartwells in a timely manner. So action needed. In November, we have on the resolution to stay within the PDE index. And then the capital projects transfer that we've talked about. December would be medical insurance funding rates, so that we can send those to LBT, and also approval of the transfer to LBT. And then January, recommend approval for meal prices. So that's what, things are coming up, and I think we're down to questions.
Yep.
Anybody have any questions?
I asked them along the way.
Okay. Okay.
Questions?
Thank you, you guys always do
Yes.
such a great job.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay. Okay, moving along to, thank you guys very much for that, well, very detailed presentation. Let's see, are we done 303? Nope, we did 303. All right. Item 3.04, any other finance budget items? I have none. Do you have any? Okay. Item 3.05, next steps directions.
Out of order.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think somehow we got that.
Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead to, we don't have any new business. Does anybody have any new business? No? Have none? All right. Item 5.01, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting. May I have a second?
Second.
Anybody, any nays or abstentions? Hearing none, we stand adjourned. Thank you.